When I was 24, I came across an online article on Facebook that a friend had posted. And it was by the New York Museum of Sex. The title was The Internal Clitoris. Now, this by itself was already intriguing, but what made me really curious was the comment my friend had posted with it. It said, "Astounding, I didn't know this, did you?" So me being generally interested in female sexuality, as I guess every 24-year-old feminist is, clicked on the link to see if I could learn something new. And on that day, roughly 5 years ago, began a journey that brings me to stand in front of you today, because I did learn something new, and it really changed my life. Most people are familiar with the term clitoris, but still most people have a very distorted idea of what the clitoris actually is, because it is often mistaken for this tiny, buttonish part that is above the vaginal opening, at the top right where the inner labia meet. And yes, this is the clitoris, so don't worry. But let me tell you, you haven't seen the end of it, because this is only the tip of the iceberg. The clitoris is actually around 9 to 12 centimeters long. So before I go into this even more, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I will give you a quick introduction to the anatomy of the clitoris. When a baby is born, it is around week 10 to 14 that the genitals develop. And they do this from the same tissue, from the same origin. This is called the genital tubercle, which you see at the top. And then with penises, the tissue, this erectile tissue, is directed outward and forms the shaft. And for everybody who has a vulva, the erectile tissue is directed inward and forms the clitoris. And for some people, even, it is something in between, because nature doesn't really conform to social expectations of what genitals should exactly look like. So it's basically the same thing, just organized differently, as you can see here on the picture. This is the clitoris. This whole red body is the clitoris, and the only part that you can see from the outside is the very top, which you see there at the top of the picture. Beneath that is the urethra. This is where you pee from. And then the vagina, and then down at the bottom, the anus. So this whole red body is inside, so you can't see it from the outside. And if you've ever seen a clitoris, or if you have one and you think about where it starts and then think all the way back to the anus, it's actually quite a long way, so this is a pretty big thing. And this is what you only can feel inside. You can't see it from the outside. Now, when I was 24, I had never seen a picture like this. I didn't know any of this. It was not in my biology book. I wasn't told about this in my sexual education class. I grew up in a fairly liberal household, but my parents didn't know this, and neither did my friends. I was told about fertilization and conception, and I was told how to prevent it. I read about sexual practices in a variety of women's magazines, so I think it seemed like I was fairly educated on sex. But yet, nobody had ever cared to tell me what my clitoris looks like. And this really upset me. It was a shock for me when I found out about this. In the beginning, I couldn't really admit to myself that this was new information, because it didn't fit my self-image at all that I was someone who didn't know what a clitoris looks like. In my mind, I grew up in a Western world where women were equal, people were educated on sex, and I was emancipated. I owned a vibrator, for Christ's sake, so not knowing what a clitoris looks like, I couldn't deal with that. I think my first solution was just to suppress that there was this lack of knowledge. And I stumbled on this information by accident. It was just facilitated by the mysterious ways of the internet and social media. But for the moment, I was overwhelmed with the information. But in the back of my mind, I was, of course, still curious. And so I think the universe just kept sending clitoral content my way. A while later, I discovered an artist on Tumblr. Her name is Sofia Wallace. So for those of you who don't know, Tumblr is a blogging website, so more social media. She's a photographer, but she also makes clitoris art. And on Tumblr, I discovered this. In her art, she expressed something that I had felt inside the whole time, but was unable to put my finger on. Namely, that it was a great injustice that nobody had told me about the clitoris. So this is just an extract from her work. Democracy without clitoracy is fallacy. Let that sink in for a minute. It took me a long time. With this, after a while, I started to realize that not knowing about the clitoris was not just about me or my personal sex life. Instead, it was telling about the still existing injustice in our society when it comes to gender equality. And it was telling about the way we subtract pleasure, especially female pleasure, from our sexual education. And it was also telling about the way we teach people to look at women's bodies, namely to see them for less than what they really are. So this kind of upset me. And once I realized that, I bought a book, and then another book, and I went to workshops, and just started to talk to people about this. I began to educate myself on this topic as much as I could. In 2016, I even wrote my bachelor thesis on the cultural history of the clitoris, because it both bothered and fascinated me that there were so many myths and misconceptions and misunderstandings about this organ that ultimately had also shaped and influenced my life. And it took me a lot of work, and actually it is a still ongoing process, to liberate myself from this doubt and misconception about my body that society and education had planted in me. I experienced the difference it made to know about the clitoris for my sense of independence and autonomy. And in the beginning, when I first learned about this, the information was really difficult to grasp. Now, at least I had an idea of what the clitoris looks like, but I didn't really understand it. I didn't understand the proportions, how big it is. I mean, actually, as you've seen in the picture, there's no significant size difference between penises and clitorises, and I think this is something that surprises people the most. I mean, of course, penises come in all shapes and sizes, and so do clitorises, but because this body of erectile tissue is basically the same, just, as I said, organized differently, there's no large difference between the two, and most people don't know that. So I didn't understand that at first either. It took me a long time to really grasp that. But once I became more conscious of what I was learning, my first reaction was, oh my God, everything makes sense now. Now I finally understood why this thing feels good and maybe this other thing doesn't feel so good, even though everybody's telling me it should feel really good, but it doesn't. And let me break it to you, vaginal orgasms are not a thing. And everybody knew that until Freud came along and, kind of effed it up for everybody. So understanding genital anatomy really helped me to understand my body. And it baffles me that in sexual education, still today, we only talk about erections and ejaculation and orgasm when we talk about the penis. And when we talk about other genitalia, all I hear is eggs and conception, and maybe, if nobody's too ashamed to say it, menstruation. And it also upsets me that still in every women's magazine, I can see a 101 sex tips section, and 99 of them are about seducing men or how to become a more exciting and better lover. When in my experience, the best way to become a good lover is to know your own body first, and then to be willing to invest the time and energy to get to know your partner's body too. And then the other 2 sex tips are probably about the mysterious G-spot, which is not mysterious at all, actually, because the G-spot is just your prostate, which is part of your internal clitoris, which you could have known if you had learned about it in school, along with the eggs and the conception and the menstruation. But we don't. So, because of my own experience, and because so many people approached me to share the knowledge that I had gained about the clitoris, I felt compelled to create a space for people of all ages and gender to catch up on this knowledge and to talk about how it makes them feel. Because if we refuse to teach people about the full anatomy of the clitoris, we keep people, especially those who have a clitoris, from reaching their full potential, not just in bed, but in the world. We are complicit in making them feel and seem inferior by not talking about their power, and by lying to them about their abilities, we keep them small. So, it is 2018. This knowledge has been around for centuries. There's really no excuse not to teach this. And often people say, oh, we don't teach this because we don't want to give them ideas. Now, let me ask you something. Think about the brain, this marvelous organ that has enabled our species to become what we are today and that controls our entire life. We can't see it from the outside, but a great deal of our human identity is shaped by the fact that we know it's there and we know how it works, sort of. So just imagine someone saying, oh yeah, the brain, I'm not going to teach that in my biology class, might give them ideas, maybe they will start to think. That would be outrageous. Nobody would say that. But still, this is exactly what we do to genital anatomy. And not just that we keep this knowledge from people, we also make them feel ashamed for not knowing. So tonight, I shared my story of clitoral awakening with you. And for me, learning about the clitoris has meant knowing my value in a world that is constantly trying to tell me that I am less than. So before I end this, I would like to ask you to think back to the time that you first learned about the internal clitoris and think about what it means to you and how it made you feel. And maybe if you had your clitoral awakening today in this really short time, I would encourage you not to feel ashamed for not knowing, but instead to see it as a springboard for change for yourself and for society. Thank you.